Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the study of implementing safeguards in fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states of the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji, and I am your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 12th thematic consultation topic or theme so far, and this is the first in a series of consultations and discussions on implementing safeguards in fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states. In today's consultation, we are joined not only by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the ADB, but also by Rosalind McKenzie, Jean Williams, and Irina Novikova, as well as Farilla Brown, a Senior Safeguards Officer in the Pacific Division. Other experts, including Taniela, Cindy, Zara, Madhu, are also here and joining in the consultation, and will be engaging with us for the discussion as well as responding to feedback. Our first session on the Pacific is primarily with the government stakeholders in the Pacific. Our vigorous outreach and follow-up with thanks to Taniela and the teams, we have significant registrants from the Pacific. Since our update from yesterday stood, we had 68 participants. So far, though, today we have 93 registered, of which 54 or 58% are external to the ADB network. A further breakdown shows that we have 12 Pacific countries represented today, with 38 of our participants originating from there. The rest are from other regions. In this consultation, Rosalind McKenzie, Jean Williams, and Irina Novikova will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have authored and provided input on implementing safeguards in fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states. The study will also focus on the relationship between their research and the relevance to the safeguards policy update. From these presentations we will hear from today, we are hoping that participants from the Pacific and across other ADB regions, like yourselves, will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy and propose recommendations from perhaps a Pacific perspective to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming or future revised policy. Comments received from this consultation and thereafter will inform the revision of ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle reminders. As stakeholders and participants, we have all consented when joining. The ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box now. Before we move further, I would like to call upon Ms. Farilla Brown of the ADB's Pacific Department to offer a blessing and a prayer and inaugurate this opening session for the consultation. So, Ms. Brown, may I please call upon you to offer the opening remarks, the opening prayer and blessing for the session.
Thank you, Azim. Since our original person is has joined us, Mr. Jope, I'd like to hand it over now to him. Thank you. Over to you now, Jope.
Thank you very much, distinguished colleagues, and thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And greetings to you all from those who are joining in this important consultation. And may I kindly request us that we bow our head and close our eyes in a word of prayer. Let us pray. Dear Lord, our Heavenly Father, we are indeed so grateful that we come together as work colleagues and stewards and as your children to come and fellowship at this hour to talk on an important agenda item, which is to deal with safeguard and policy review with regard to sustainability development in our region and in our world. Thank you for the organization, the ADB, and its leadership, and also allowing this time for us to come and talk with each other and talk with each other on this important agenda item. We uplift the program to you and all the participants and the experts and all those who are listening in today. Let this meeting be blessed by you, dear Lord. We ask for your Holy Spirit to lead us and guide us, and let your will be done in this consultation process that we are going through. Thank you for the life of Ms. Jean Williams and her team, who will be presenting on behalf of the Pacific region. We ask for your blessings to be with them too, dear Lord. This is our prayer to you. Please forgive our sins. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jope Davatanivalu. Mr. Jope is the Acting Director, Environment Monitoring and Governance from the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. And that was an absolutely beautiful and auspicious way to, I believe, start today's session. Let me just provide some opening framing remarks. A few gentle reminders, as I mentioned, that all of today's consultations, and as we've consented to, are being recorded for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. As I mentioned, should you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address that now appears in the Zoom chat box. I request, as we're all doing now, to join from a quiet, distraction-free area. And please, if you're not speaking, please turn off your microphone. And during the Q&A session, when Farilla invites you to, you may ask questions by either typing them into the chat box or raising your hand through the Zoom feature. Farilla would then ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera so that you can ask your question live. As we are all colleagues and friends, and we want to instill a spirit of cordiality here, please be respectful to other speakers and participants. And Ms. Farilla and I will manage to keep the time for the consultations to within our schedule. If you experience difficulties with the consultation or cannot hear each other, a reminder that IT support is provided. You may ask for IT support by typing your issue or query into the chat box, and one of the team will address and assist you. Other guidance notes when using some of the important buttons in Zoom. Just a reminder to please mute yourself when you're not speaking. So may I request all participants to now click on the mute button at the bottom left-hand corner of their Zoom screens. If you feel any of us as speakers are speaking too fast and you would prefer the speaker to slow down, you may ask us to slow down by going to the bottom of the Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you can then press the slow down button, which is the two reverse arrows pointing to the left in white. Or if you think we're going too slow, you can ask us to speed up by pressing the speed up button, which is the two fast forward arrows in blue that point to the right. This will let us as speakers know to either speed up or slow down accordingly. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. When you found your own name, click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, and then click on the Rename button. After you click on Rename, please type in your name, the agency that you represent, and then click on OK. If you wish to send a message to everyone in this forum, question or share feedback, click on the chat button and this will allow you to send a message. If you wish to comment or raise a question live, click on the smile icon or the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then click on the raise hand emoji. When Farilla asks you to speak, you can unmute yourself, click on the microphone button, and then to show your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders assembled here today. So let me refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. I won't read all of this information, but just a reminder that these sessions are being recorded, as I mentioned. And if you wish to opt out of the recordings or the distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the screen. If you have any issues or concerns on the recording, the confidentiality, or the potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination, please contact us via the email address on the screen. In this consultation, we have around 2 hours, and here's what we have to maximize your time as well as ours. Aside from the wonderful opening prayer that we just heard, we have Mr. Bruce Dunn, who will provide some welcome remarks. Mr. Dunn is a director of the Safeguards Division in ADB Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. The third presentation will be by Ms. Rosalind McKenzie, a Principal Operations Specialist, a Principal Operations Coordination Specialist on FCAS, who will share the main issues and findings and context of the study on implementing safeguards in fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states as related to the revision of the safeguards policy statement and its forthcoming update. This will be followed by our fourth presentation by Jean Williams on safeguards requirements for FCAS and SIDS and the shared approach. Jean is a principal environment specialist also within the Pacific Department of the ADB. Prior to our moderated Q&A session, we will have our fifth presentation on the FCAS benchmarking findings and the key recommendations offered by Irina Novikova, a principal development specialist within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. After the fifth presentation by Irina, and these will be brief presentations, we have a short 5-minute break. And when we resume, we will be joined for the moderated discussion on the topic of implementing safeguards in FCAS and SIDS, facilitated by Ms. Farilla Brown, a senior safeguards officer in ADB's Pacific Department. This will be a Q&A session that runs for about 75 minutes or so, and you may ask questions and share experiences in the chat box or through raising your hand using the Zoom features as I explained previously. Farilla will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversation. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Mr. Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and the next steps following the consultation. Thanks, and it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome and opening remarks. Mr. Dunn, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim, and good day, welcome, and thank you to all of you for joining today's regional consultation for the Pacific, which is being organized as part of the review and update of ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short. And we're really pleased to see so many of you joining us today from the Pacific community. And let me also give a great thanks to Mr. Jope from SPREP for those opening blessings and the prayer. That was really appreciated. I think it was a great start for today's session. Now, the purpose of today is to discuss with government representatives from the Pacific on your experiences and your perspectives with implementing ADB safeguards in the Pacific, and specifically on how ADB safeguards should be adapted or implemented differently in the context of small island developing states and fragile and conflict-affected situations. And as mentioned by Azim, this is actually the 12th regional consultation that we've undertaken since we've started this process to update ADB's safeguard policy. And some of you may have joined previous sessions. However, for those of you that haven't, I'd like to just start off by providing some brief background into the process of updating ADB's SPS. Now, we launched this process in August 2020, and this followed an evaluation of the effectiveness of the SPS by ADB's independent evaluation. That was concluded in May 2020. And that evaluation recommended that ADB should update and modernize the policy by building on the evidence of implementation experience, as well as looking at recent safeguard policy updates from other multilateral financial institutions, and also thinking about how we should customize the policy for ADB's work with sovereign financing with governments such as yourselves, our developing member countries, and also the work that ADB does with non-sovereign financing with the private sector. Both, of course, are very important in the Pacific context. And in addition, the evaluation recommended that ADB should adopt a new approach to strengthening and using country safeguard systems. Of course, that's a very pertinent topic for today when we talk about later in the session about a shared approach for the Pacific. And also how we should strengthen ADB's own implementation framework for safeguards. And underpinning that, they also saw a need for us to enhance our guidance that we provide to our developing member countries and clients, and also our approach for building skills and capacity. So these were the main recommendations of the evaluation study, which ADB's management then endorsed in full and then kicked off an update process. The process of updating the policy is expected to be implemented over about a 2.5-year period. And we're currently targeting the new policy to be considered by ADB's board by March 2023, so in about a year's time. As part of that, we're undertaking a series of analytical studies. And for today's session, we did prepare a background paper on the application of safeguards in fragile and conflict-affected situations and small island developing states. And then using these background studies, we then go into a series of regional consultations with our developing member countries and also with civil society. This is a process that we're continuing. We started it last November, and we're going to be continuing with the consultation process through to about June this year. We're then going to be working on the drafting of the new policy. And as we draft the policy and make that available for public consultation, we'll then go into further rounds of consultations to get feedback on the actual draft. And that will continue, of course, until we are able to get a reasonable consensus on the policy and then take it forward to our board. Now, there's a series of background papers, including the one that I just mentioned on FCAS and SIDS. We'll be providing these also through the chat box today. You can see the links will be there to a range of the background materials. Now, turning a little bit to today's topic, we're going to be focusing on the experiences from the Pacific, and in particular, how we should better adapt the implementation of safeguards to the Pacific context. Now, this is important given the very unique situation and challenges faced in the Pacific. These are issues, of course, you're very aware of, but just to name a number, of course, the geographic remoteness, the small size of many of the nations, dispersed populations and markets, and often narrow base of the economies, plus, of course, the increasing exposure to natural hazards and climate change. So there's a range of issues, and these are things that we need to consider as we look to how we can implement safeguards effectively. Of course, ADB as a development institution is committed to working with you and supporting the sustainable development in the region, and the safeguards are important, but we also need to make sure that we get the safeguards right and that we're able to effectively work with you and support you on their implementation. So that's really what today's session is going to be about. And I'm, of course, very thankful for many of you joining us here today. And we're looking forward to hearing your views. So with that, let me now pass over to my colleagues. We have got 3 short presentations for you, as Azim has mentioned, just to set the stage. And then after that, we'll be going into further rounds of consultation. We'll have an open forum. With that, so let me hand over to my colleague, Ms. Rose Mackenzie. She's going to be speaking more about the Pacific context and fragile and conflict-affected situations in small island developing states. I'll pass over now to Rose, and thank you once again for joining. Over to you, Rose.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And thank you to all participants for this opportunity to briefly set the scene for our discussions today on ADB safeguards in the context of fragile and conflict-affected situations and the small island developing states in the Pacific. Now, when we talk about FCAS and SIDS, we're referring to a very specific environments. Next slide, please. Where the geographic challenges of remoteness and small dispersed land areas and populations present a formidable backdrop to achieving sustainable development results. Heightened exposure to both slow and rapid onset climate change and disaster caused by natural hazards presents unique and existential threat. Narrow-based Pacific economies with limited options for diversification, the high costs of doing business, and high import-reliant economies are also extremely vulnerable to exogenous shock. Civil unrest and violence and/or conflict, driven by a variety of fragilities, remain ever present throughout the Pacific subregion. And chronic constraints in government capacity can lead to suboptimal and unequal access to public services, amongst others. Finally, let us not forget that these challenges are compounded and further complicated by the ongoing COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. So how does ADB make sure that its operations in FCAS and SIDS environments are as effective and sustainable as possible? Well, first, ADB's overarching Strategy 2030 mandates the identification and use of differentiated approaches in FCAS and SIDS. Now, this means doing business in a context-specific, fit-for-purpose way, recognizing that standard ADB processes and procedures are not appropriate for all situations. Honing in on the Pacific subregion, ADB's 2021 Pacific Approach strategic framework is helping our Pacific developing member countries build resilience at the practical operational level by using innovative context-specific procedural flexibilities in its programming. It introduces comprehensive climate action at national and regional levels and long-term holistic capacity supplementation to better respond to the needs of each Pacific SIDS. The Pacific Approach is also building a robust and rigorous analytics and diagnostics base to better inform FCAS and SIDS operations. And finally, ADB's institutional-focused FCAS and SIDS approach, also approved in 2021, works at the corporate level to tailor internal business processes and expand the necessary knowledge, analytics, and capacity to strengthen overall ADB responsiveness in fragile contexts. This, in a nutshell, is ADB's approach to effective programming in FCAS and SIDS in the Pacific subregion. Next slide, please. I'd like to hand over at this point to my colleague, Jean Williams, Principal Environment Specialist in the Pacific Department, to focus in on the safeguards dimension of operations. Jean, over to you.
Thanks, Rose. Kia ora, talofa, bula, iorana, malo. Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased you could join us today. So as Rose explained, next slide, please. As Rose explained, ADB is adapting its procedures and enabling a differentiated approach for working in FCAS and SIDS. We do note, though, that the Safeguard Policy Statement, the SPS, is quite limited when it comes to FCAS and SIDS. It can deal with conflict-affected situations through emergency assistance, and the assessment of social dimensions can require identification of social risks related to political instability, conflict, fragility, and vulnerability. An IED evaluation in 2020 specifically identified a need to address challenges related to weak governance and limited safeguards implementation capacity, a need for higher levels of ADB support for country systems, and a need for flexibility to adapt procedures in recognition of the unique FCAS and SIDS context. Next slide, please. For some time, ADB and a development partner we work very closely with, World Bank, had been receiving requests from many of our developing member countries to better harmonise our safeguard requirements. These were very much seen as same, but different. There were also very clear safeguard implementation challenges related to small regulatory agencies, small implementing agencies and PMU. ADB and World Bank started to ask, how can we better adapt what we have? And how can we work together for coordinated capacity development? Next slide, please. The World Bank had prepared some simplified procedures for safeguards in the Pacific. These were a great effort, but were too World Bank focused for use by other development partners. We recognized that we needed an approach that was founded on country safeguard systems and focused on project delivery rather than development partner project preparation requirements. We looked towards the Pacific Region Infrastructure Facility, which had been established in 2008 as a coordinating mechanism for the key development partners working in the region. Through the PRIF, we established a safeguards working group, and the PRIF partner safeguard experts worked together in this group to develop the shared approach between 2015 and 2019. Early drafts of the shared approach benefited from very detailed reviews by ADB, DFAT, World Bank, JICA, and the US Department of State. Next slide, please. The key purpose of the shared approach is to agree a common approach to environmental and social risk management for infrastructure development in the Pacific, to improve both the efficiency and effectiveness of ENS risk management and infrastructure projects, and to streamline collaboration between development partners and the developing member countries to better manage ENS risks and impacts. Next slide, please. There are three key objectives of the shared approach, and these are focusing on use of methods and procedures to develop and use common methods, procedures to identify, assess, and implement plans to mitigate potential ENS risks and impacts in projects supported by the PRIF development partners, to strengthen and improve country safeguard systems, and to work together to share knowledge and good practice and collaborate to build institutional and technical capacity for improved ENS implementation throughout our DMCs. And this is linked to other key platforms and initiatives such as the Pacific Learning Partnership. Next slide, please. The shared approach has been developed recognizing three closely linked factors that are very important influences on development activities in the Pacific. These are the scarcity of and deep attachment to land and natural resources, the importance of traditional leadership and decision-making practices, the importance of community in designing and implementing development projects. And the shared approach has developed 4 annexes which recognize these special issues. Next slide, please. So the DMCs will benefit from application of the shared approach through a more efficient and effective project delivery by applying good international industry practice to the unique conditions in the Pacific, a use of a common lexicon and terminology for tools and instruments that are commonly used in ENS management processes, an improved counterpart understanding of development partner processes, and strengthening and assisting DMCs to apply their own CSS. Next slide, please. So in summary, the shared approach is an agreement to use common approaches, terminologies, and procedures more firmly based in country systems. It's been approved for use by PRIF development partners. And what the shared approach is not, is it is not an alternate safeguard policy. It's not a substitution of development partner policies, and it does not modify or amend existing development partner policies. Thank you very much. And I'd now like to hand over to Irina Novikova to take us through the benchmarking study and key recommendations.
Thank you very much, Jean. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining today. Next slide, please. So we've mapped out, so far we've mapped out where ADB stands in terms of the policies and requirements and development of specialized approaches such as shared approach to work in FCAS and SIDS context. So I would like to now switch gears and look into the benchmarking study that we have done and to compare requirements that exist in other MDB's safeguards policies and frameworks. Next slide, please. So under this analysis, we'll look primarily into the frameworks of the World Bank, IFC, EBRD, and IDB, which is Inter-American Development Bank. And first of all, looking at the broader picture, we can see that requirements related to FCAS and SIDS contexts are spread out and anchored across three main standards in other MDB's frameworks. And this is standard 1 on integrated environmental and social impact assessment, standard 4 on community health and safety, and other standards, standard 10 mostly numbered as 10 related to stakeholder engagement and consultations. So when we look at standard 1, you could see over time that MFIs have shifted towards assessment of contextual risk factors and acknowledgement that such risk factors should be part of the project assessment, and conflict and fragility belong to that group of risk factors that have to be assessed. Once we do have an approach at the project level to the assessment of contextual risks, MDBs factor that assessment into the overall project risk categorization. And this becomes an important criterion for project preparation and capacity building and sort of course of action during implementation. Some MFIs, in particular the World Bank and IDB, they also extend such assessments to human rights due diligence, and they cover impacts on internally displaced persons and refugees and gender-based violence. And this is a particular explicit point in IDB's policy. And MDBs also develop specialized tools for conflict analysis, and such tool exists in ESF of the World Bank. Next slide, please. When it comes to standard 4, this standard on community health, safety, and security risks has a lot to offer, usually when it comes to issues related to fragility and small island development states. First of all, this standard requires the borrowers and the banks also to factor in community health and safety risks to assess them and avoid them and minimize. And this is a very important strategy because there are different types of risks that fall under this dimension. There are risks related to climate change and natural hazards. There are risks related to what project does to its natural environment and the project's impacts on ecosystem services, which we all know communities depend upon in most of the cases. And the standard 4 explicitly emphasizes the vulnerability of communities when ecosystem services get affected. That needs to be taken into account. Also, when we look at these requirements, there is also a set of very well aligned requirements concerning the risks related to the use of security personnel. And you would see these requirements in all MFI's requirements, either as requirements or as guidance. Next slide, please. A cross-cutting theme in all MFI frameworks is related to the risks of gender-based violence, or GBV, risks of forced and child labor and trafficking in persons. And we all know that in the context of fragility and conflict in particular, the risks of this phenomena are much higher than in a general project context. So there is a very high level of alignment on policy provisions and guidance related to GBV risks. And you would see that this is not necessarily a policy requirement, but it's these issues can be covered in depth in guidance materials. And of course, there are also detailed stipulations on prohibitions related to trafficking in persons and prohibited forms of labor, such as forced and child labor. And this is nested mostly under Standard 2. In addition, sort of from the bird's eye, as I mentioned before, when we look at the conflict and fragility, there are also very important implications on how we conduct stakeholder engagement and the risks for consultations that exist in such contexts. And all ADB and all comparator MFIs have strong provisions that require meaningful consultations to be undertaken in the atmosphere of free of intimidation and coercion, free of manipulation, interference, discrimination, and reprisals. What you see with other MFIs is that there is a lot of additional guidance having been developed and specific requirements in the policy being incorporated on reprisals specifically and retributions in projects. So that also an important area that deals with the issues of meaningful consultations. Next slide, please. So this is a very, very brief sort of bird's eye view on the findings of the benchmarking, but I would really like to refer you to the report itself. It has much more information, and we also try to do our best to aggregate all available guidance in this area for reference. Now we can switch to key issues for further consideration, what ADB in our policy update process, what we would like to consider. And there are three areas that we would like to focus. First of all, let's talk about enhanced policy and guidance. And in this area, we would like to consider the adoption of an integrated risk classification in projects and integrated environmental and social impact assessment. And many of you who participated in other discussions have heard probably and discussed a lot about this topic. For the context of FCAS and SIDS countries, we think that this is also a very important point to be achieved, and there will be new policy provisions related to the closer integration of environmental and social impacts. Coming out of this, also the acknowledgement that we do need to incorporate contextual risks, and these have to be reflected in the project risk categorization to account for risks related to fragility, conflict, violence, or insecurity, or any other types of instabilities or challenges in the projects related to the project implementation. In this, what does it give us? If there is a project risk categorization that accounts for fragility and conflict, then it will trigger consideration of a range of potential mechanisms to deal with those risks. And at the moment, we are looking into different ways on how to meet those challenges. In particular, we think that the instruments that would allow us to deal with these risks should be focused or centered around the idea of safeguards readiness and risk criteria. And we would consider using different operational modalities to make sure that projects are ready on the safeguards front, but there is also flexibility, and there are differentiated approaches to how to deal with such challenges. In addition to the policy requirements, we would also look into developing tools and guidance on social risk analysis. And it was mentioned by Jean that there is a requirement on acknowledging and analyzing such risks, but it's not very explicit, and it may not be fully implemented. So we would also like to look into this issue with more details. And in particular, also we would like to see we would like to see into the issues of delivery of consultations, the GRM, in FCAS and SIDS environments. Next slide, please. In addition, when it comes to land acquisition, we acknowledge that this is one of the key issues that is quite relevant, and many challenges actually are related to land acquisition. And in particular, in the context of the Pacific, we think that it will be quite helpful when we look at land acquisition requirements. We would also provide some better guidance and better, clearer requirements on the application of voluntary modes of land acquisition. And these types of voluntary transactions, if you will, relate to land donation, to leases, land pooling, land swapping. There is a range of various transactions that fall under this category, and also willing buyer, willing seller arrangements that may be better tailored to the specific context of the countries without necessarily triggering the eminent domain laws in the country. In another set of policy recommendations and guidance are related to, again, standard 4, or what may become a standard 4 if we adopt the performance standard model. And these risks are related to community health and safety and security, and incorporation of better requirements or more explicit requirements on ecosystem services to be better aligned with other MFIs. And of course, in relation to community health and safety and security, look into the development of requirements and guidance related to gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and harassment, and the use of security personnel. Again, it may become a requirement, it may be a guidance. So this is work in progress still. And on the last point, we would also review the applicability of other MFI's guidance in handling allegations of reprisals, retaliation, and retribution. This is a very important topic that would be also covered under the stakeholder engagement requirements and standard. Next slide, please. So that was as far as policy recommendations are concerned. The second area that we would like to consider is the expanded application of the shared approach. So potentially we would consider formalizing it in the new safeguards policy as an option. And we would also consider providing some additional requirements or guidance for the use of the common or shared approaches overall. And the third area of our recommendations or interventions for the future is related to procurement. And this acknowledges the difficulties of the physical location of the Pacific Islands, but also structural sort of institutional constraints that we face. And in this regard, for ADB, we think that it's quite important to revisit procurement arrangements, especially in the context of SIDS and FCAS SIDS. And in particular, we would like to look into the pre-qualification performance criteria for contractors to make sure that these contractors are not are the types that possess relevant experience of working in the Pacific. And this is not necessarily driven, the whole process is not necessarily driven by the lowest cost bid approach, which doesn't necessarily give us the necessary quality of the contractors. And we would also like to see how the contracts can be structured in a way where there is a reflection of the social mediation costs as part of the contract, and there are institutional arrangements or arrangements within the contract that would allow civil work contractors to liaise with communities and have social specialists on board to be recruited to work with communities. So these are the types of issues we would like to consider and sort of get some more coverage on the procurement front. This summarizes my presentation, and I would like to give the floor back to Azim, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Irina, and thanks to all three of the previous speakers, Rose McKenzie, Jean Williams, and yourself, Irina Novikova, for the wonderful overviews, and also for providing us with clarity, feedback, and some of the unique challenges and processes related to implementing safeguards and FCAS and SIDS in the Pacific. And of particular interest, the issues related to the differentiated or shared approach and factors that influence the effectiveness and consequences of development activities in the Pacific, as well as, of course, some of the other topics, subtopics we heard from you. I'd also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. We hope we can get further feedback from you on what ADB should consider in these policy topics and areas during the facilitated Q&A session. This session will run for about 75 minutes, but as I mentioned earlier, there is some flexibility in that. Let us now pause for a brief 5-minute break, but before we do, can I please invite you to just think about a poll evaluation that we will have a little bit later on that will help us to improve the way we manage and consult with stakeholders like yourselves. The link to this poll question is posted in the chat box right now, and you can register your responses on the menti.com website. The link is in the chat box. So before you head off to get your tea, your coffee, or your favorite drink, just a heads up that we're going to be asking you for some formal feedback a bit later on the specific areas that we could improve on to better engage, discuss, liaise, and interact with you, solicit your feedback and opinions on consultations like this. After we return from this 5-minute break, we will have a Q&A session moderated by Farilla Brown. Farilla is a Senior Safeguards Officer within the Pacific Department, and that covers operations in the Cook Islands, Republic of Fiji, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, Nauru, Niue, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, the Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. So you will see on the right-hand side of your screen on the next slide that we have a countdown timer. When that countdown timer reaches 0, you'll know that it's time to return to your screens. And as well, when the music begins to fade away, you'll understand that the session is about to start. We have 3 guide questions flashed on the screen that Ms. Brown will take us through. And she will also explain the order in which we will take questions. So with that, let us pause for a brief 5 minutes and look forward to seeing you back at the screens in a few minutes. Thank you and enjoy the break. Thanks very much. Thanks very much and welcome back. We will now have an open and facilitated discussion as moderated by Farilla Brown, a Senior Safeguards Officer in the Pacific Department of the ADB. Just a reminder that you can ask questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in the Zoom feature by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So let's start, and without any further delay, Ms. Farilla Brown, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Azim. Thank you as well to our presenters, Rose, Jean, and Irina. And as we're now on the Q&A session, I'd like to just remind everyone about the sequencing, or who goes first in terms of answering or responding to their questions. So firstly, we'd open up for statements and sharing of perspectives and recommendations based on the presentations that were previously done. And then we also encourage everyone to post their questions in the chat box, but we had only received one advanced question that was sent through the Zoom registration. And unfortunately, that person's not here with us, but we had wanted to call upon that person to pose their question. So may I call upon our participants to please raise your hand and just come off your microphones and your videos, turn your videos on to share any recommendations or any reflect on some of the presentations that were previously done. And if not, you can have a look at the framing questions that we've posted on the screen to sort of help guide in framing your questions, or sharing any experiences that you've had in terms of implementing safeguards requirements in your specific countries. May I also call upon Sokotia Kulene from Tuvalu. I think it was really good to see that ADB is actually contextualizing what the PICs have and developed in terms of safeguards requirements in the PICs. We all understand that sometimes it gets very challenging in terms of implementing the requirements of donors such as ADB. But this is an opportunity and a chance to hear what you guys feel what ADB should be doing to sort of help you guys implement, our requirements as a development bank. Anyone? Okay, I see Claire. Yeah,
I'm happy
go
to
ahead,
jump.
Claire. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just happy to jump in and kick off. If people are a little bit shy, I don't mind jumping in, but I definitely want to be hearing from some Pacific Islanders in this forum. For people that don't know me, I'm a social and land specialist that's worked in the Pacific for a decade. So I've worked in a lot of the countries, and I've worked across different MDVs, so World Bank, Asia Development Bank, DFAT, etc. So I guess I've had a good experience with the types of challenges that happen in infrastructure projects particularly. And I guess one of the questions I wanted to throw out to the ADB team was around, because a lot of the key challenges have been captured very well and very accurately in your documentation around the constraints that are faced in the Pacific and the operational challenges. So I don't think it's too much of a secret you know, some of the challenges, but it's actually making it operational. So how do we jump from those sort of key findings to changing the operation? So maybe it's a question around change management and how that's being institutionalized, because the Pacific is a very unique context, and it's really important that the people working in the region understand the particular risks and challenges that are faced in this region. Thanks, Ferry.
Thank you so much, Claire, for sharing those experiences.
I can give an example if that helps. I'll leave it to you to.
Okay, thanks, Claire. I think I'd like to call on Sokotia Kulene from Tuvalu to speak. If you'd like to unmute yourself and turn your video on, please. Talofa, Mr. Kulene, can you hear us? Okay, while we're waiting for Mr. Kulene to join, Claire, would you like to share that example that you had mentioned, please?
Sure. One of the things that Irenia talked about was actually procurement, and I guess this is one of the areas for a bit that innovation could be seen. So it's one of the constraints that I've faced as a consultant in this space when we're in a situation in the Pacific where we do have a limited pool of safeguard specialists, and we want to upskill the existing specialists as well as kind of recruit new specialists. And I think procurement sometimes makes it challenging to build capacity of individuals. We're not able to put in a bid that has, you know, it's always an international with a national, but that doesn't necessarily allow you to do the mentoring that's required. In some circumstances, we're asked to do capacity building plans, but they might not extend to safeguards. And I'm talking just generally here. So I think the way that contracts are written influences, I guess, safeguards and how that's done in the Pacific, as well as the architecture of the projects themselves. So in some countries, there's a centralized unit where technical support is available, but that's very rare. And I think some countries struggle with that. So I'd like to see ADB responding around those two key issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. I'll let Jean respond to that question. Thank you. Thanks, Jean.
Thanks, Ferry. Thanks, Claire. And look, your observations are well noted and certainly by me well accepted, because I think you and I have had more than a few discussions around this kind of point. I think, to me, I sort of see it being undertaken in two parallel ways, if you like. We certainly need to address procurement, and I think safeguards we need to do that for a whole raft of reasons. So we need to be working closely with our procurement colleagues on trying to address some of these, what are basically becoming systemic issues and problems, ongoing problems in project delivery. Another thing is that as individual team members, we really need to be encouraging our project officers who lead these projects. We need to encouraging them to ensure that there's adequate time for capacity building and mentoring built into a project. It's not just about delivering a road, a bridge, or a new jetty now. We really need to look at incorporating capacity development through every avenue we can. So we just need to build in more time for that in projects. But again, it comes down to personalities. Some project officers just like to quickly get on with things, and while others are more receptive. So I'll just sort of leave it there in case anybody else has any further observations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. My colleague Rosaline would also like to add further to that question posed by Claire. Over to you now, Rosaline.
Thank you so much, Frida. Claire, I thank you very much for your question. It is extremely timely because you talk about the need to better respond to the context, yes, to better understand the context. That's the foundation point from which ADB is going to improve how it operates and its implementation arrangements in the Pacific, both in procurement and capacity. So let me share with you that under both the Pacific approach that I mentioned earlier and also the FCAS and SIDS approach, also approved just last year, ADB is really pushing towards better understanding and developing those fragility and resilience assessments for all of our FCAS and SIDS countries, so that ADB staff from the corporate level right down to the project design level, everybody understands better the context that they're working in. This is key to how we begin even the pre-concept of any type of intervention in Pacific FCAS and SIDS. So we're working on a framework for fragility and resilience assessments in the Pacific, and we're hoping to roll that out over the next 12 to 18 months. So please watch this space. Now, how does that translate into procurement issues and challenges and also capacity? Well, when ADB staff across the whole institution understand better what it means to operate within FCAS and SIDS, they look at the standard ADB processes in a different way. For example, our procurement colleagues are working, they have been working very closely with the FCAS and SIDS team in both the Pacific Department, but also across ADB, the corporate level FCAS team, to work out and identify those trigger points, yes, the specific areas of challenge in procurement. Once we know those, we can look at how we design differentiated approaches, that different way of doing business for FCAS and SIDS. This is ongoing. We're hoping that in the next quarter, or maybe by Q4 of this year, we will see a much more visible and a greater awareness within ADB about how to use differentiated approaches in procurement and also capacity building. I mentioned earlier capacity supplementation and capacity substitution. Again, we need to look at this on a context-specific basis. There's no one size fits all in the Pacific, we know that. And we just need to work out a better systematic way of responding to these very contextual environments. I hope that that helps answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose, for that response. That was very comprehensive. And
can I have
I'd like
the opportunity?
Sure. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the opportunity for being here. I am the new director for Gender Affairs Department here in Tuvalu. And thank you, Mr. Dunn, Bruce Dunn, for those opening remarks. In terms of the question given by ADB, let me share some of our experience here. That, well, I thank Irina that she mentioned one of the standard, the integrated environment and social impact assessment. So basically for us here in Tuvalu there are two different ministries that look after this assessment or this important document, or they have a different portfolio working to. So it's better for us to centralize, to cover in one place. In terms of social impact, this is a different department, so it's a huge work for us to deal with here in Tuvalu. And also the other thing is that the violence, domestic violence or gender-based violence, is under my ministry and department. One of the challenge we face is our safeguards, or we refer that to a referral path of our victims in domestic violence. So this is another challenging for us here in Tuvalu. This is really new in terms of trying to work with the referral pathway on how we can deal with victims and our clients, and along with the counselors. So this is another issue that is covered in, it's challenging within our department or our ministry for ADB to look into those challenges. But I also thank Claire for raising that procurement issues. Is also part of our issue here in Tuvalu. But thank you, Jean Williams, for that very explanation. It gives more thoughts on that. Facilitate.
Thank you so much, Director Sokotia, for those wonderful, for sharing those wonderful remarks and experiences. Before I hand it over to my colleagues, Jope and Kele, may I also take this time to encourage our participants. I understand that we've got some of our implementing agencies present here who are currently implementing ADB safeguard requirements. Please take your time, and then you can come off, pose a question about some of the challenges that you're facing and how do you want ADB to make them better. So please have a think about it while I pass on the floor to Jope, and then after Jope, I'd hand it over to Kele from FRA. Thank you. Over to you now, Jope.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Farila, and thank you for the opportunity to come and share with you in this consultation. And thank you, Jane, for the invite and allowing me to bless this this program. May I start by saying thank you to ADB contribution to the Pacific Learning Partnership on Environment, Social Sustainability. One element of this capacity building program is raising the understanding of the importance of environment management plan. And it was through this partnership that ADB brought in Mr. Alan Sewell to share his knowledge and the importance of environment management plan, which we always see that is always neglected or overlooked into this environment planning process. May I also share with participants and to share my appreciation to ADB. The presentation by Ellen Sewell was excellent. It was the practical examples and using the examples within the Pacific. It's well understandable, and I do hope that that kind of training or opportunity is shared with all our project officials and even regulators in the Pacific region. So I'll start off with that one. That's my first comment. And my second comment, I've been working in the region for 9 years now, and I've been seeing the turnover of officials who are working in this space. Environment social safeguards, EIA, or environment planning, or environment act enforcement. So there is always a change in phase or people saving in this. And yes, one thing I really want to pick up is the last presentation in this consultation, where it talks about integrated environment and social impact assessment. And something that comes before this is the integrated risk classification. I would like to touch on the risk side of things. Sometimes in my experience working in the region with these new staff turnover, new team members coming into this piece of work, the understanding of the importance of knowing the risk within the development process is something that I believe that needs to be revisited and strengthened. Because for some of us, we come in and focus our work only on this is the process, this is EIA process, or this is something that is needed in the environment management plan, but to understand the process of identifying or picking up or coming up with an associated risk. This is something that I believe that needs to be strengthened more within the ADB process, or for any partners who are there dealing with this kind of work within the region. I thank you again, Farila. I'll stop there, and it's good that you're sharing this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jope, for that wonderful comment about the partnership that we're doing collaboratively with our other regional partners, and also for sharing your experience. I'd like to call upon Kele. Kele is a colleague from Fiji Roads Authority that who currently implement the transport projects that's supported by ADB. So you can come off, unmute yourself and turn your video on. Kele?
Hi, Farila. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk on some issues and challenges that we face on ground. Thank you, Jean, for the presentation. I think there's a challenge that we faced here is the emergency works. I know that we've had this discussion a few weeks ago, and in regarding the emergency and the due diligence, just a suggestion, if ADB could take emergency works into considerations when it deals with screening and categorization of our application. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was a very valid point. And Jean, would you like to respond to that?
I didn't actually catch a question. I'm very sorry.
Sorry, so Kelly was actually referring to the discussions we had around the transport project in terms of emergency works, if ADB can sort of consider perhaps the safeguards due diligence requirements, because emergency works can, especially after cyclone, it can, government needs to immediately undertake those works. But if ADB can, perhaps his question was relax some of the due diligence requirements when it comes to emergency works.
Okay, well, there are specific features of the existing SPS which apply to emergency assistance, but the government is required to do certain things, such as declaring a state of emergency or officially declaring that a disaster has happened in order for the emergency assistance provisions of the safeguard policy to apply. When they do apply, it does mean that a different approach for safeguards due diligence can be undertaken. But I think the situation on the Fiji project was a little bit different, because they were works being undertaken within a project that had already been approved. So I guess in that sort of situation, it could come down to more of a conversation between, in this case, Fiji Roads Authority staff and the ADB, just to make sure that we had minimum requirements addressed initially, and then and how they needed to be developed on a case-by-case basis. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jean.
Thank you, Jean.
Any other person from our panelists that'd like to add to Jean's response?
Farila, this is Bruce here.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just add briefly, Jean's already captured part of it. Something I think we can do more though is developing more specific risk screening checklists for emergency situations and perhaps even in the future for Pacific context, you know, start to develop something more tailored for the situations. And of course, you know, with climate change, we can expect more emergency situations, and it's something that we need to be able to respond quickly. Something that we try to do in these approaches, and this is of course when you know, an emergency situation has been declared and triggered, is we have these more flexible procedures, and we try to take an approach that would allow some of the rapid work, you know, particularly humanitarian life-saving activities, to move forward really quickly, you know, and not hold up financing for that. But if you go into more sort of significant reconstruction activities or new infrastructure in response to an emergency, then of course in those situations you do need to have the due diligence work still prepared and staged. So, you know, I think that's something that we could work on. But again, I think one of the key points that we'll keep coming back to today is how do you customize a lot of this for the Pacific context. So we're really keen to hear from you know, Pacific colleagues around your recommendations on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I'd like to call on our colleague, Rosamond. Rosamond is the director for the Ministry of Lands in Tonga. Rosamond, over to you.
Thank you, Farila. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you clearly.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentations. And I think it's very heartening to just read through to sort of reflect on the recommendations and how ADB wants to move forward the review of its safeguards policy. It's positive to hear that I work mostly on the land acquisition side of most of the projects here. And with a growing number of, I know we refer to capacity, with a growing number of nationals engaged in social safeguards, it's a very positive, and it's good looking forward. And this has been achieved very much with the support of both ADB, World Bank, and our partners. Also with SPREP and SBC, we've started to build that capacity nationally. I'm very glad to hear that that there is an endeavor to look at a new approach to the national safeguards system. And this is where I think Wendy Lee had sort of typed up in the chat box the importance of guidance. The presentation of the shared approach emphasizes that this is an agreement on using common modalities, common terminology, but it will not replace what is agreed between countries and ADB in terms of policies, principles, etc. So I think this is where Wendy's quite right. It's important that we have the guidelines so that we are all taking the same approach. One of the issues that we have with implementation, as you know, is working through the implementation plan and the action plans for land acquisition, and ensuring that we meet our obligations and our commitments as a client. And it was referred to earlier, I'm not sure whether it was Jean who referred to it or Rosalind, that it does sometimes come down to the project officers and the engagement with clients and with countries in terms of how much, how shall I put this, flexibility is afforded to us for implementing on the ground. But at the end of the day, when contracts are signed, there are certain milestones that have to be met. So, you know, getting over those strict timelines, providing the flexibility. And I think this is where we referred earlier to procurement. So when projects are designed, when the procurement process is in place, that common understanding that these challenges are in place and some flexibility is provided is quite critical. Of course, not compromising the overall objective and what we want to achieve. So I look forward to guidelines that allows us to be more flexible, but let's not lose sight of the objectives of projects, the delivery of our development aspirations. And it's good to see that we're looking at some applications for the voluntary modes of land acquisition. As was mentioned before, national legal systems and land tenure can be challenging, but if there is a more open-minded approach and we have shared agreements prior to moving forward with the new policy, I think we will be in a good place. And most of all as well, ensuring that the capacity is there, because this will always be an ongoing process for all. So I'm quite thankful and my appreciation to ADB for taking this initiative and look forward to engaging more at the country level. I think when engagement at the country specific level is conducted, that we may have more contextual inputs from the Tongan side. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosamond. That was very, very encouraging. My apologies. Miss Rosamond is not the director. She's the CEO for the Ministry of Land, and she's been really, really supportive in ADB projects that we have in Tonga. So thank you so much again, Rosamond. I'd like to hand it over to Bruce just to respond to Jope. Over to you now, Bruce. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to everyone that's spoken so far. Mr. Sokatia, Mr. Jope, Mr. Kele, Ms. Rosamond, and also Claire from Cardno earlier, really appreciating to hear all the great perspectives. And we need to make sure that we come back in turn and respond and discuss further on all of these issues. So we'll just take a bit of a team approach to trying to get through to all of those questions. Before coming back to Rosamund's good points, which I have to say really appreciated on the land acquisition side, I might have one of my colleagues, perhaps Jean and also Irina, who specialises in voluntary resettlement, come and speak a bit more of those. But I'll jump back to the point from Mr. Jope from SPREP a little bit. He spoke about the integrated risk assessment and the need to look more comprehensively at risk issues. Now, this is obviously really critical when you're working in places like the Pacific and where fragility and conflict situations can occur, and how do we consider this? Now, typically, we've focused on an impact assessment approach, and we've taken each project and we've looked at where is it located? What's the physical footprint? What's the type of project? Infrastructure, for example, what are the physical impacts that are going to occur in the location, direct and indirect impacts, maybe cumulative impacts, but it's all around the project. But that context in which a project takes place, the social context under which it's taking place, the governance and capacity issues that we're talking about here today, how is that going to contribute to the implementation issues, the preparation issues, the available people to be able to support and implement on the ground? Or we've been touching on other issues. For example, Mr. Sokatia from Tuvalu spoke about the gender issues and violence. Those contexts are so important for understanding the risks, not just about, the things that we can control when we build a project, but the wider risks. So this is something that ADB across the entire policy is wanting to give more attention to. We're looking to revise all of our risk screening approaches and to add specifically this contextual risk analysis, as well as looking at sort of the capacity, performance and management side of that. And that will give us a better understanding it will then allow us to more specifically tailor the approaches. And this will also be something that we'd like to connect or dovetail a bit with the work that Rose McKenzie spoke about already. She mentioned the fragility and resilience assessments that we're looking to undertake for our Pacific FCAS and SIDS countries, and to understand that context. So that assessment can also plug in to the safeguard assessment, so we've got a more holistic picture and understanding of risks. So I just wanted to mention that into response to Mr. Jolpe's questions, but happy to come and discuss that more. I'll pass back to you, Frilla. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Can I call upon my colleagues in Samoa who are currently implementing ADB funded projects? I understand we've got some of our colleagues from the Land Transport Authority, Samoa Ports Authority. I mean, just share with us some of the challenges, some of the issues that you guys feel that this platform will be able to provide some responses and address and resolve some of those challenges. Anyone? Anyone from our Water Authority of Fiji? Okay, I'll come back to you guys on that one. But can I pass it on to Ian Haggerty, who's got a question or a comment perhaps? Over to you now, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Frilla, and hello everyone. My name is Ian Haggerty, and my main reason for being here is working with Vanuatu and the Vanuatu government on various projects, including ADB. And I've worked on two sides. I've worked on the project management side, but also the regulator side. So my background is fueling my question. First of all, a comment on Jolpe's point about risk assessment, and fully agree that we should move to a better form of risk assessment. And a request to Bruce, who's just come off talking about that, please don't overcomplicate it. Things are busy and hard enough as it is. In the Pacific and in Vanuatu, it's about sitting down and storian with people. It's about talking with people. And so we should actually understand what the difference between standard mitigations, which are common to many projects and we don't need to talk about, and those that actually matter. And I kind of wonder, and Jolpe's point was very well made about process overtaking the need for the bits of the project, such as risk assessment. So often PPTAs are too rushed and don't take into account local conditions or considerations. I'm working on an ADB project just now, which will remain nameless, as will the country, but it assumes the users of an asset are the people who are currently on the land at present, and that is spoiling the design of the whole project. That's just one example. Okay, so much for that. So a request to ADB, please don't overcomplicate and give time to us to talk to the right people and come up with the right solutions. The other question is really holding a mirror up for ADB. And that is, Rose mentioned it, Irina mentioned it as well, and it's the side of procurement. Pre-qualification, as far as I can understand, does exist, as too does the ability to nominate both key and non-key specialists. So that actually exists already, and it should be linked with the PPTA outputs and risk assessment. I would recommend that, and also ask you, because implementing a policy requires change from everyone, what steps is ADB undertaking to implement change management procedures and processes internally to ensure that the policy, whenever it's finalized, is implemented well by ADB? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. That's so great to hear. hearing you telling ADB not to overcomplicate things. Things are already, complicated in the Pacific, so we need to simplify at ADB. Before I call upon Wendy, who's been posting lots of really good questions in the chat box, can I hand it over to my colleagues to respond to Rosamond, please? Thank you. Jean and
What was the question, please?
I think it was more a comment around encouraging not only to simplify our requirements, but to ensure that the objectives still remain. So it was mainly a comment. Rosamond, you can please, jump in.
Sorry, Farila. Yeah, it was
Thanks,
my
Rosamond.
observations. I didn't really pose a question. From the presentations today, I think we've got enough to sort of reflect upon what ADB is looking to achieve. And then we can start. And then when we get to the country-specific issues, we'll be, I think, in a better position to provide more of the customized and contextual issues specifically for Tonga. It was just observations. I didn't have any questions posed. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosamond. I believe my colleague Irina has something to share in response to what you shared, Rosamond. Over to you, Irina.
Yes, thank you, Farila, and thank you, Mr. Rosamond. Very important point, and I just wanted to go back to your comment and question on the flexibility and guidance. My experience, actually, I need to share that my experience comes mostly from Central West and from working in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I just wanted to share that what we mean by flexibility and what we mean by a framework approach is basically looking and tailoring the processes of safeguards readiness, if you will, to be synchronized with project design readiness, detailed designs being ready, capacity being in place, so that we sort of come away a little bit from that processing priorities, and this is also the point is highlighted by Claire in her comment, that we are very much oriented towards our processing timelines and deadlines. So I just wanted to share that in ADB, there are basically two different approaches at the moment. So one approach, which is a framework approach, and it kind of exists already under the emergency preparedness, where safeguards instruments and planning may actually defer till the actual implementation of the project, when people are hired, when there are people on the ground, and we know more about how due diligence can be done in a better way. But this is complicated by our desire to do everything very quickly, So if we have a framework approach, if we apply a framework approach to projects whereby we basically say that we need allocation of more resources for staff, for due diligence, for consultations, time for consultations. And we need to acknowledge that the timeline of the project implementation will get longer. And all of us in ADB also have to be on the same page. And we need to agree that that's what's needed. And that would allow us to tailor technical assistance, resources better to the time when actually we are ready to do safeguards due diligence and implement safeguards plans. So that's one. This is what we term as a framework approach. And the other approach is emerging from the application of different modalities, such as we now have small expenditure financing modality, and we also have project readiness financing modality. And this project readiness in particular has been quite
strongly sort of supported in the context of Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular. What it does, it allows projects to be prepared well in advance using much higher levels of assistance, so that by the time the project is implemented, we actually have all our ducks in a row, in a sense, in terms of safeguards due diligence, project design readiness, and all these processes and procurement are synchronized, so that the project can move on to the civil works stage and not compromise safeguards implementation. So these are different approaches, and we would like basically to acknowledge that the risk categorization and the analysis that goes into the integrated assessment would allow us to choose what is more applicable to a particular project on the table, right, at our attention. Using this opportunity, I also wanted to ask a little bit more about the voluntary land donation, if we could come back to this topic, because that's an important topic, and I can see sort of various types of feedback on this, what it means in the context of Pacific. And I just want to confirm that we would like to clarify in the policy what voluntary land donation is and where it should be applied, and what are the sort of the criteria of application, because we also there are specific risks related to the application of voluntary land donation in projects. So we would like to hear more from you on the limitations, on the definitions, and on the risks attached to use of VLDs. Over to you, Farila. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irina. I'd also like to add that there's a specific guidance in the shared approach relating to land. So Jean had previously presented on the shared approach. I'd like to call upon Wendy, who's been busy typing away questions in the chat box. Over to you, Wendy. Wendy, are you still here with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I am.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure. Yes. My latest one was about procurement, because this has been a particular problem for a project we're working on in Papua New Guinea at the moment, which is a climate change resilient project for outer islands, which are, the extreme of small islands, as it were, and trying to use ADB procurement guidelines to do multiple small projects at the same time in scattered islands is just proving a complete nightmare. And if you go by the criteria of having the lowest bids, or even, the most pre-qualification experience or whatever, you're not going to get very far. What's really needed is criteria which give weight to the community development skills and the community approaches and capability for capacity building, and also local knowledge of these small environments. And so there needs to be real change in terms of the types of procurement which still keep it safe and sound and protect it from any kind of fraud or misappropriation. But at the moment, what you tend to get is big contractors who go out to these small islands, throw a few water tanks at them and a bit of guttering, and possibly build it for them, and then bugger off. And what you're left with is a community that has had no kind of real mobilization or information about WASH or the other sorts of community engagement that needs to go around these small projects to make them more resilient. So that was just one point on procurement.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Before I hand it over to my colleagues to respond to Wendy's comments and share of experiences, can I hand it over to Sam to pose his questions? Over to you now, Sam.
Hi, Farila. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you clearly, Sam. Thank you.
So I've got something not working with my video. I was trying to get that on, but it's not working. So you'll have to probably just listen to my voice. But thank you for this opportunity to contribute to the ADB safeguards review, policy review. Unfortunately, my internet has not been very stable, so I kind of missed quite a fair bit of the presentations that were presented. But I just want to make two observations. The first one is I think it's a wonderful thing that ADB is reviewing its policies and taking into account the needs and requirements of the SIDS. But I always found that in my experience in Samoa, Samoa policy on environment and social safeguards tend to be, well, behind the ADB. There are a fair bit of gaps in our Samoa policy that that are there, which when it comes to ADB funded projects, likewise world funded projects, are issues that are raised, and which of course Samoa as a grantee or the borrower have to comply with to satisfy the requirements of the banks. And I see that gap kind of widening with new issues that are incorporated into ADB's policies. We're a bit sort of slow in catching up. I know a lot of our policies and a lot of our laws tend to be driven by international conventions that we sign up on. Convention on Safety of the Child, Convention on CEDAW, and all those related to women's rights and stuff. So those are some of the conventions that have given rise to the need for national legislation so that we can satisfy requirements of being parties to those conventions. And in some cases, the same international conventions are reflected in some of the things that are introduced by the banks in their safeguards policies. So that's my first observation. It's just that there's that gap there that we need to look at. And as we review policies and update them, I can see that gap widening. And I guess it's there's a need to address that. And I guess that might lead to the question of capacity that we're talking about. I make that comment recognizing that when we sign on to loan agreements or grants agreements, there's always that statement there that projects design and implementation will have to comply with the policies of Samoa as well as the policies of the bank. So, but when you have gaps in policies, you have that sort of vacuum there that you need to address. And there are cases wherein it's easy to bring the two together. Otherwise, there are cases also where there are conflicts in the requirements of both the bank and the country. We've always been working on the understanding that it's the requirement of the bank that prevails. And I have one example in Samoa, but it hasn't been a problem because Samoa saw the need to comply. And so we did comply, we made the changes. So that's the first point. The second point that I want to make is that I think it's particularly interested in the emphasis placed in integrated risk management and integrated environmental impact assessment and social impact assessments. I'm just wondering what are the implications for the safeguards instruments that flows from an integrated approach, even though now we always speak of EIA as an integrated multidisciplinary document and so forth. So when there is this sort of renewed emphasis in integrating risk management, as well as are there any implications on the safeguards instruments that you need to prepare? We have still a separate IEE that you need to prepare for category B, or EIA for category A, as well as a separate poverty social assessment that you need to prepare during the design phase. So those are just some thoughts that have come into mind, but my apologies because I missed a fair bit of the presentations because of my unstable internet connection. Thank you, Farila.
Thank you so much, Sam, for sharing those experiences. It's always good to hear from someone who's practicing and currently implementing, our safeguards requirements. And it's really good to hear those challenges that you've highlighted. Before I pick up some of my government colleagues who I can see their hands up, so that's Anna and Perina. Can I hand it over to my panelist colleagues to respond to Wendy and Sam's observations and questions? I believe Wendy's comments and observations were more on the land acquisition bit and the voluntary. So Irina, and I guess it's the same with Sam as well. And Jean can also take on the integrated risk assessment on enviro and social in terms of the implications on the instruments that we have.
Apologies, Farila. What is the specific question on the voluntary land or land acquisition?
It was from Wendy. Wendy?
Sorry, Irina. This was a question I typed rather than verbalized. I was really saying I was very pleased to see that there's going to be a concentration on looking more carefully and providing guidance around various forms of voluntary land acquisition. And there was some mentioned in the presentation, which sounded like that quite a lot of thought has been going into this. And really, I wasn't really asking a question too much as more encouraging ADB to say that I've found a lot of problems around trying to work out what ADB's position would be on various types of donations or land leases and how they're negotiated and so on. It's difficult. For example, in Samoa at the moment, there's a negotiation going on around the ports for a quarry around land leases, and that's become quite complicated because there are contractors and then there are subcontractors, and there's the village council, and there's lands that's classified as freehold but in fact was thought by the village to be customary. You know, there's all manner of complications, and I'm sure each situation is different, but I'm just saying that that's a really fertile area for ADB to be concentrating on and trying to give clearer guidance to people like Sam and me and others who are trying to work out what is the correct procedure and what is the best way forward in these quite intricate land issues. And a lot of them are not sort of straightforward commercial land acquisition in terms of outright purchase. They're more to do with leases with either customary owners or small groups or village collectives and so on. So that's the kind of thing that is hard to deal with. Sorry,
that's all right. Can I just add to that? Sorry, Farila, to butt in, but I just think it's important to clarify some points because it's a very sensitive topic, as you know, Wendy. And I just wanted to let you know there is a TA happening at the moment about a regional capacity building strategy for safeguards in parallel to the SBS, where I'm sure some more regional guidance around land will fall out of it. but I think we need to be very, very, very careful about the terminology voluntary land donation. It's different to land acquisition, and it's different to land access. It's different to negotiated settlement, and it's there is guidance about it, but it should be applied in very, very rare circumstances where the community is directly benefiting, for example, from a water, having drinking water installed in their village. Voluntary land donation is definitely not appropriate as an avenue. It's very rare that it's appropriate, and I think that's why we need to highlight the guidance is required around that, so that we tighten it up, because it's a terminology that's used quite loosely and it's a little bit dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both, Wendy and Claire. I think it's really a very critical issue. I would, first of all, I would like to also refer you to the summary, analytical summary on land acquisition. I think we have a very sort of in-depth coverage on the intentions on how we want to approach the scope change in the application of land acquisition in the future, and the intent is to exactly that, to clarify the scope of application and also expand it to different types of land transactions, and including voluntary land transactions, and or this is not necessarily donation, but other types of voluntary transactions, including market transactions, willing buyer, willing seller transactions, so that we have a basic understanding and we are on the same page of what we mean, and provide some specific definitions about such transactions and negotiated settlement, for example, as well. So I would basically refer to that study, but in the interest of time. In this case, I think there will be additional guidance, definitely, on the application of specific transactions such as VLD and its applicability to a particular context in the project, and impacts or sort of impacts on people, how we can ensure that the interests of people who are donating land or who are using or forfeiting their land for the project, they benefit from the project. So this specific guidance will be developed under land acquisition standard, and I think there will be also one area where we are trying to strengthen is the linkage between Indigenous people safeguard and land acquisition, so that there is more clarity on the modes of transfer of land which belongs to Indigenous peoples. So that's another area that we are trying to provide more guidance and clarity in terms of requirements. Thank you. Over to you, Farrell. And I would be happy to engage. I just wanted to mention to engage offline as well, and we can clarify a little bit more on VLD. I would love to hear more about that. Thank you. Over to you, Farrell. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Irina. Just to let everyone know that we've got 10 minutes left. So last call for people to comment and share their experiences. Jean, would you like to respond to Sam's question around the implications of the integrated risk assessment for environment and social?
I'm not 100% sure because I was off the call. I've only just managed to get back in. So it might be a question better directed to Bruce, however.
Right. Bruce?
Try and have a good day, okay, without fire.
Rilla, can you just clarify further? I was just typing away to one of the other responses.
Yes. Sorry, so Sam was quite happy on the emphasis placed in integrated risk assessment on environmental and social safeguards. However, he wanted to know what the implications would that would have on the instruments that we currently have.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's right. Thank you so much, Sam. Thanks also for clarifying, Frilla. So there's quite a bit of work to be done on this, actually. Going back to the topic of integration and risk assessment, something that we've seen across our work, you know, in the Pacific, but also in other regions, is we've been just very fragmented. We've produced, you know, environmental impact assessments. We've prepared resettlement, land acquisition plans. The processes, though, have tended to be fairly fragmented, like our policy. And we see a wider need for just this context understanding and for social analysis. Like Sam, you mentioned the, you know, poverty and social analysis processes to really more comprehensively inform the entire project. And sometimes we've seen that some of that good social analysis work might be informing the resettlement planning processes, but there might be gaps in how that information is understood and shared across the environmental assessment or vice versa. So we don't necessarily see like a major change in the instruments. You know, we're still going to need to do those processes of environmental assessment based on the risk, of course. You know, you need to customize it depending on the issues you're facing. Not everything needs a detailed impact assessment. And as Ian Haggerty was also mentioning, you know, in some cases, if we're just dealing with small scale infrastructure and it's really just standard construction management, that might be all we need. But in other cases, you need a more detailed assessment process, and we want to make sure that that has more integration. A lot of that, I think, comes from having more of a broad-based social analysis process that then, as appropriate, can link into more detailed social impact assessment. But a lot of it is also about dialogue between the teams, the environmental and social teams that are working on projects, and with people on the ground, you know, how these issues really connect up. But well, obviously we don't want to overcomplicate it, like Ian was referring to as well. We do need to keep it simple, but we want to make sure that there's a shared understanding about the context and the risks that we're facing with projects. So yeah, I think that's something that we will need to develop a lot more guidance on, and obviously a lot more capacity and training and support for projects around how to take that more integrated approach.
Thank you so much,
Perfect. Thanks,
Bruce. Can I hand it over to Anna and Perina? So Anna can go first, then over to Perina. Over to you now, Anna.
Can you hear me? Can you hear
Loud
me?
and clear. Yeah.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Anna. We can hear you.
I'll be quite brief. I'm sorry, my camera doesn't work. My question was, has anyone undertaken virtual community consultations or include virtual measures in their SPEs, the stakeholder engagement plan? So I am participating today from Ministry of Infrastructure's PMU for the Readiness Fund project for the ports upgrade, as well as the bridge. So the reason why I ask is the detailed designs are pretty much completed, and we're working on the remaining safeguards requirements. However, the project has been exploring opportunities and innovative ways of collecting community feedback, including online survey with more than 500 respondents last year. But now we have to go back for a round of consultations because of the volcanic eruption justifies more the reason why we need a bridge. One of the areas where we had only surveyed 20%, we need to go back. However, with the outbreak of COVID-19, we have restrictions and lockdowns, but we have had virtual missions which have been successful. So we are looking into doing a virtual community consultation. So I was just keen to know if anyone had done it before, how successful it was. We will trial the one here in Tonga and definitely share it with our colleagues as well. Reflecting on Standard 1 and talking where it states integrating community input into the designs and traditional leadership. My question was in terms of states of emergency, where there's a top-down approach and many restrictions during COVID-19. And then finally, my comment on contextual risks, which we are experiencing in our project with procurement. So there's a very high risk that comes as a component of mobilization with the general and preliminaries, almost across 15% loading of risk, and the justification from the bidders are COVID-19. And then if we are to think about the local labor that they would be engaging for a large infrastructure that's $50 million US, how about the employees when Tonga doesn't have a labor legislation passed yet? It is still a labor bill. So what kind of protection do we give these communities that we are advocating to be in the labor force of projects in their area? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing those comments and your experience as well. Can I, before I hand it to Perina for her questions and comments, can I hand it over to my panelists, colleagues, for someone to respond to those comments by Anna, please? So this was relating to virtual community consultations.
Farila, I can just come in briefly. I'm not sure if
Bruce.
Jean or others have got experiences in the Pacific context around virtual consultations, but we have, during this time of COVID-19, started to do that in a number of countries where we have been working. Of course, it has to be prepared in a very careful way as to how to do it. Do people have access? Is it something that they'll be comfortable with? And a lot of background preparation needs to be done to make sure that the dynamics of a virtual consultation can work, but also that it's a safe space. In fact, that's something we've been hearing a lot of concerns about from civil society, about making sure that virtual consultation formats can be safe, where people feel that it's okay for them to be able to speak, that there's no risks of intimidation or possible retaliation if they raise their voices. Of course, these can be things that can occur in physical formats as well, but there are some particular nuances to how you need to do that in a virtual environment. So we are getting some experiences on that, but to be honest, it's a big learning area for us as well. Something that our teams are now doing, actually, I've got a consultancy that we're just about to start to try and review our own experiences during the sort of last 2 years of COVID-19 and how those processes have gone. And then secondly, to develop up some guidance around how to support these kind of virtual consultation processes more, but it's definitely a work in progress. So I'm not sure if there's others on the call that have got experience in doing that in the Pacific context. It would be great to hear. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Anyone else would like to share their experience in terms of undertaking virtual consultations, community consultations, before we pass it on to Perina? So I guess not. Well, Perina, if you can come off your mic and just pose your question or comments, and then we can finally go to Aso. Hi, Perina, over to you.
Yeah, hi, Farila. Sorry, my internet was unstable earlier when you called on someone from our end, but my questions are pretty brief. It's just some of the challenges that I personally have been experiencing from our side of things. So I think it was mentioned before that some of the policies, I think it was mentioned by Irina for standards 2 for child labor. I think it would be good to just make it a bit more clearer in our policy gaps in terms of the ages of these child labors, because I think well, like locally, I think 16-year-olds are considered adults, if I'm correct. But in other countries, 18 is considered adults. So I think that's just something to just make clear in those policy gaps and other policies that I think you can be more clear in that. And my other comment would be, I think the bank is trying to have the involvement of women in a lot of different aspects of the projects in terms of the construction team and also the maintenance contracts. I think the requirement was to include 30% or I think 40% of women. But I think this can be reconsidered, because realistically here we go by qualification, not by gender, which it could be very difficult for us to achieve, given it's one of the goal and the target that the bank is requiring us to reach. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges, and a lot of other things that we haven't yet come across in our other projects that are being introduced, within the ADB policy. Another one is also for the involuntary resettlement. So from my experience in past projects, we would usually have to, provide prompt compensation at full replacement cost for assets that cannot be restored, or has to be restored at an equal higher value. But from the policies that the bank is requiring is that, aside from that, we would also have to, have additional revenues and services through the benefiting of any schemes that are possible. And also for people who have been resettled, we have to provide them with, lands, which is understandable in that case, but we would also have to provide them with employment, and we also have to give them trainings. Though I do understand this is, a requirement for the bank, I know that the aim is not just to give a road, upgrade a bridge, it's also to enhance the capacity of the whole project area. But it would be nice if it can be mentioned in the policy, allocated resources that can help us do all these different types of due diligence. Because I think you're also aware that our team is quite limited, and it's a bit of a challenge, and it's something that can be mentioned a bit more, clearly, and just some assistance in that area. And just on the land context as well, maybe to just make it mention it to be a bit more region, more related and realistic to the region. In Samoa specifically, we don't deal with land returns or land poolings or land donations, to my understanding. So maybe it would be nice to just clearly state in, somewhere in the policy, if applicable, or, if fit, because the way we are given all these requirements, it seems that we have to meet every single requirement. And it's a bit of a struggle for us, because it's not really realistic to our culture in some ways and what we're used to. So those are just some of the challenges that I can recall so far from, just the projects that we're about to start with, with ADB. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Perina, for providing those experiences and commenting on, the current policy that we have in terms of the safeguards requirements. So before I hand it to my team to respond to those comments and experiences you've shared, can I call on Aso, who's our last person, to pose a question, and then our panelists will provide responses to both you and Aso's questions and comments. Aso, can I call upon you, please? Perina, I'm not sure if you're with Aso, please. Do you know if she's
Yeah, I'll just message him, Trela, sorry.
Thank you. Or while Perina is trying to reach out to us, so can I
Farila, I wouldn't mind commenting on some of her, something that she raised, if that's okay, Farina. Oh, you're on mute, Farila.
Sorry, Claire,
just quickly about talked about the women involved in construction, and I think if we zoom out on that issue, I think it's a very valid point, and it's definitely worked in many projects very well, but not all. And I think it's really the question about the policy dealing very well, much better with the social benefits of a project. Some of that might be local content, what we call local content in Australia, so that local employment component. But I think the social benefits as well as the social risks need to be captured somehow more holistically. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. Asol, are you there now? We're really running out of time. Okay, I guess not. I'll hand it over now to our panelists to respond to Perina's questions and comments. So I understand she had a question around child labor. I saw that one of my colleagues had posted a response there. And then she had a comment around the implementation of, the involvement of women in projects. She also commented on involuntary resettlement in terms of compensation and additional benefits that the government should be providing to affected parties, and the challenge with the limited resources that they have. Anyone from the panelists would like to respond to Perina's questions and comments, please?
Firila, I can mention a few items that we are in the process of developing. So this, again, I would like to mention that this relates to the new standard on land acquisition. In particular, on the first question on additional schemes and benefits that will be helpful to affected persons to reestablish their livelihoods. We will be issuing a new livelihood restoration guideline that will hopefully cover many of those issues. And again, we would like projects to be risk-oriented, so there will be greater emphasis on vulnerabilities and addressing vulnerabilities in particular project context. So that's kind of a cross-cutting theme for us to consider. On sharing the costs, this is a very important topic, and it's also covered in land acquisition summary paper. We would like to provide more clarity on how ADB can assist in covering the cost, and the rules on this already exist, and there is a co-sharing of costs related to livelihood restoration, for example, not directly for land costs at this time, but we would provide a little bit more clarity on that as well. And in terms of the fitness of various transactions or modes of land acquisition, definitely the requirements will not superimpose a specific requirement if it's not relevant for a country context. So what we are trying to do is to formalize and cover descriptively the range of possible transactions and categorize them and sort of provide a dichotomy in a sense and see how, depending on what mode of land acquisition is chosen, what due diligence is required and what criteria are applied and how they are integrated towards the classification. Let me address also, there is a question on classification. So if before voluntary land donation was outside of the scope of involuntary land acquisition, so the idea now is to include it into the scope of application of a broader standard. So it will be considered if there is a land acquisition mode which is not necessarily eminent domain, it will still be considered as part of the land acquisition, and it will be within the policy as opposed to outside of the policy. Thank you. Over to you, Firila.
Thank you so much, Irina, for that very comprehensive response. everyone, thank you very much for a fruitful discussion. We've come to the end of our Q&A session. So I'd like to now hand it over to Azim. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Farilla. Mr. Jope, Farilla, Cindy, Rose McKenzie, Jean Williams, Irina Novikova, as well as others who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes. You know who you are, but of course, a huge and special thank you to the participants and informants for raising and sharing your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of your experiences, and the constructive feedback that you've offered. I want to reiterate that the comments on the study on implementing safeguards in FCAS and SIDS that we received from this consultation will be considered in the final study report, and you can continue to send your comments through to the ADB via email. All of these will inform the revision of ADB standard and updating the safeguards policy statement. But please don't go yet. As I mentioned before, on your screen, please give us your feedback. You will see the question now. Please rate your satisfaction with today's session on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most satisfied, with 1 being the least satisfied. Please just tap into your keyboard in the next maybe 30 to 60 seconds now, your impression of the level of satisfaction you had with today's engagement and consultation. So rank us and rank this consultation from 1 to 5, and then you will see on the chat box the link to the menti.com poll where you can provide more detailed, specific comments in the form of 3, 4, 5 sentences, and that poll will be open until the end of the day, so maybe 4 or 5 hours from now. You can still comment and add your specific inputs and insights on how we can improve the level of these engagements and how we can encourage more participation from stakeholders like yourselves. But for now, please rank this particular session on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the highest, 1 being the lowest, and we'll have that poll now. There it is. So 95% said 4 or better, but the 5% who scored neutral, and even the 35% who said they were somewhat satisfied, please tell us what we can specifically do to improve the level of engagement, discourse, consultation, and feedback from stakeholders like yourselves. So before we go, I now would like to bring you back to the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department and overall this process, Mr. Bruce Dunn, to give us a summary of what we've heard and walk us through the next steps after this particular consultation. Bruce, could you please review the discussions and lead us into the next steps? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Azim, and great thanks to everyone that joined today. Really fantastic comments and recommendations, and obviously pointing out to a lot of the challenges in working in the Pacific and the need for ADB to basically adapt and take a change management approach to working with you around the safeguards, but also more broadly in terms of how we do our development work in the Pacific. We've gone quite long. Apologies that we've run over time, but we did want to make sure that we had a chance to hear everyone's voices, and it's been very dynamic, including in the chat. So I've been trying to keep up with that. I will just try to briefly summarize on some of the key points. However, we are just taking a recording to be able to capture the key points, and we'll be making a summary of everything today. And I think most importantly is we'll be then deliberating on the key recommendations and how we can take that forward. A few of the key points just to mention, of course, the need to understand the Pacific context. I think that's one of the key issues that obviously comes through. And there are steps being taken by ADB. Of course, this session, this analytical work around fragility and resilience assessments, but this is obviously going to be a long-term process of understanding and adapting to the context. Along with that capacity, we heard a lot about that today. Challenges with meeting and understanding all of the diverse requirements in ADB's safeguards or in our procurement. I think something that we need to take note of for the new policy is also keeping it simple, customizing approaches also to the Pacific context. There are differences and gaps between national requirements and ADB and other financiers, and that's something we need to understand and see how we can address those in the context of projects. The shared approach is one way that we're looking to try and work through some of those issues. That's in a pilot phase at the moment, and we need to be able to take that forward and continue to be able to adapt. Challenges manifest themselves in a lot of different ways. Small number of people, small and limited staffing, challenges with having people that understand the Pacific context and experience, and that relates. Here I'm not just talking about, for you in the Pacific, it's also about us in ADB having the right capacity and experience and numbers of staff to be able to support that, and certainly the need for longer term collaboration and technical assistance programs. So, those whole issues around context and capacity, I think, are really overriding key ones for us to understand. Then just to touch on a couple of other points. Gender, obviously this issue came up in a number of ways during the session. Need for wider opportunities and benefits for women, need to have more specific performance indicators and support for resources, and also issues like gender-based violence were brought up. Challenges with procurement, obviously the need to again customize that. Big procurement packages and small islands and outer islands obviously don't mix very well. This, I think, is an ongoing issue as to how to design those packages in the right way that can attract the right sort of bidders that have got the local capacity and experience, and then how they work through local processes. And this includes also recognizing the limited pool of safeguard specialists and how we link to capacity for that. So a lot of issues there. We need to be coordinating also with our procurement teams, not just the safeguard side. We had a bit of discussion. A few people came in around the risk assessment processes and more integration on that side and how to apply it. Again, though, the need to keep it simple is certainly heard. Land acquisition, obviously challenging, given the context and history in the Pacific and customary land use issues. So obviously understanding the tenure systems and then developing more specific guidance. I heard that a number of times, the need to customize that and support. Also, we had mentioned about emergency assistance projects and how we could support that. We currently use framework approaches, and there's need to, I think, continue to work to simplify and support those processes. And then lastly, I'll mention, I think this brings together many of the points raised, is the need for a long-term change management approach and support. ADB does have technical assistance in the Pacific, and that's something that we need to continue. We're also looking at a long-term approach for our work around FCAS and SIDS. And then similarly for our safeguards, we need to have, really a long-term approach for the new policy rollout, capacity support, staffing. That's something, ADB needs to boost, skills development. So this really has to be a long-term, but also a shared approach. We will work very closely with you in the Pacific governments, and also with our partners, like we've had SPREP today, and with civil society, of course. So yeah, lots to be done, and I very much appreciated just hearing all of your views, and we very much welcome any further submissions or comments, formally or informally. That's certainly an important part of the process. I'll just mention finally a couple of next steps. We're going to be running a very similar consultation to this one tomorrow which is open for civil society. So we want to gather further views on these same topics. Then for the wider safeguard policy update, we're running additional consultation topics, which will be happening through April, May, and then into the start of June, where we're going to be picking up additional topics like climate change, like safeguards and gender, also our work around different financial instruments. So if you're interested in those, check the website, stay tuned for other sessions. Then we're going to be working on the drafting of the policy, and we're looking to have a draft of the new safeguards policy available by about September or October for public disclosure. Then we'll be doing further rounds of consultation, but a lot to do. Oh, now I just see in the chat, I made a mistake. I said the consultation's tomorrow, but it's not. It's on the 31st of March. That's the next consultation with civil society. Thank you, my team, for alerting me to that. I misspoke. So 31st of March for the civil society. Well, with that, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you again so much from the bottom of our hearts for you joining today and for sharing all of your views. It's very much appreciated. Till next time, take care and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you, team. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.